The cold wind cut through the wooden walls like a knife as Mary held her 3 little ones close to her chest. Outside, the Wyoming winter was showing no mercy. Inside their small cabin, things weren't much better. The fire in the fireplace had died down to just glowing embers, and Mary could see her breath in the chilly air. Her triplets, all 3 years old, huddled against her worn-out dress. Little Annie was trying not to cry, while her sister Lucy kept asking when Daddy was coming home. The youngest, baby Tom, just pressed his tiny face against Mary's shoulder. Too cold and hungry to make much noise, it had been 6 long months since that terrible day when the mine collapsed. 6 months since her husband Robert never came home from work. 6 months of watching their savings disappear like snow in spring. The mining company had given her a small payment, but it barely covered Robert's funeral costs. After that, she was on her own with 3 hungry children and bills that kept piling up. Mary looked around their little home. The walls were thin, and she could see daylight peeking through the cracks. The roof leaked in 2 places, and she had put old pots underneath to catch the drips. The cupboards were almost empty, just a small bag of flour, some dried beans, and a tiny bit of salt, not enough to last more than a few days. She had tried everything she could think of. She'd taken in washing from other families, but there weren't many people in their small mining town who had extra money to pay for such services. She'd tried to sell some of Robert's tools, but everyone was struggling just like her. Nobody had cash for things they didn't absolutely need. The general store owner, Mr. Peterson, had been kind at first. He'd let her buy groceries on credit, trusting that she'd pay him back when things got better. But weeks turned into months, and Mary's debt kept growing. Last week, when she'd walked into his store with her shopping list, Mr. Peterson had shaken his head sadly. "I'm sorry, Mary, but I can't give you any more credit. I've got my own family to think about, and my suppliers want their money too. I wish I could help, but I just can't afford to anymore." Mary had stood there in the store holding her list and feeling her cheeks burn with shame. Other customers had stared at her, some with pity, others with judgment. She'd walked out empty-handed, her children asking why they weren't buying food. But the worst part had been Robert's brother William. When Robert died, William had promised to look after Mary and the children. He was doing well with his own farm just outside of town, and he had no wife or children of his own. "Don't you worry about anything," he'd told her at the funeral. "Family takes care of family." For a few weeks, William had helped. He'd brought them some vegetables from his garden and had even paid for a load of firewood. But as time went on, his visits became less frequent. When Mary would ask for help, he'd make excuses. He was too busy with harvest. Money was tight for everyone. He'd help when he could, but she needed to understand his position. Then, 3 weeks ago, everything had changed. William had come to her cabin with papers in his hand and a serious look on his face. He'd sat down at her kitchen table and spread out the documents. "Mary, I've been thinking about this situation, and I've talked to a lawyer in town. According to these papers, this land actually belonged to Robert and me together. We inherited it from our father, but only Robert's name got put on the deed." By mistake, Mary had felt her stomach drop.
"What are you saying, William?"
"I'm saying this cabin, this land, it's rightfully mine now. I'm not heartless. I know you've got the children to think about, but I can't afford to support for extra people indefinitely. I need this land to expand my farming operation." Mary had stared at him in disbelief. "But where would we go? The children and I have nowhere else." William had shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "That's not really my problem, is it? Maybe you could find work in one of the bigger towns. There are opportunities for women willing to work hard. Maybe someone would take the children off your hands if you can't manage." The suggestion that she should give up her children had made Mary's blood run cold. These 3 little ones were all she had left of Robert, all she had left in the world. She'd die before she'd let anyone take them away from her. "I need you out by the end of the week," William had continued. "I'm sorry, but that's just how it has to be." Mary had spent the last 3 weeks desperately trying to find another solution. She'd knocked on every door in town, looking for work, looking for a place to stay. But jobs were scarce, especially for a woman with 3 small children. The few people who might have helped were already struggling themselves. She'd even swallowed. Her pride had gone to the church. Pastor Johnson had been sympathetic, but the church had no money to spare. "I'll pray for you," he'd said. And Mary had wanted to scream that prayer wouldn't put food in her children's stomachs or a roof over their heads. Now, sitting in her cabin on what William had declared would be her last night, Mary felt more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. The wind outside was getting stronger, and she could hear something rattling on the roof. Snow was starting to fall, big, heavy flakes that meant a serious storm was coming. She looked down at her 3 children. Annie had fallen asleep against her arm, her little face peaceful despite everything. Lucy was still awake, her big brown eyes looking up at Mary with trust and love. Baby Tom was making small sucking motions with his mouth, probably dreaming about the milk they didn't have. How had her life come to this? Just 7 months ago, she'd been a happy wife and mother. Robert would come home from the mine each evening, tired but cheerful. They'd eat dinner together as a family, and Robert would tell them funny stories about the other miners. On Sundays, they'd walk to church together. Mary wearing her best dress, and the children in their clean clothes. They hadn't been rich, but they'd been happy. They'd had plans. Robert had been saving money to buy better land, maybe start a small farm. They'd talked about having more children someday, giving the triplets some little brothers or sisters to play with. Now all of that was gone. Robert was buried in the town cemetery under a simple wooden cross. And Mary was about to lose the last thing that connected her to the life they'd built together. A sudden pounding on the door made her jump. The children stirred in her arms, and baby Tom started to whimper. Mary's heart began to race. It was late, and decent people didn't come calling at this hour, especially not in weather like this. The pounding came again, harder this time. "Mary, open this door." It was William's voice, and he sounded angry. Mary carefully moved the children to the bed and walked slowly to the door. Her hands shook as she lifted the wooden bar that kept the door closed. William pushed past her into the cabin, bringing cold air and snow with him. Behind him came 2 other men that Mary recognized from town. One was the sheriff, and the other was Mr. Peterson from the general store. All 3 men looked uncomfortable, but determined. "Time's up, Mary," William said, not looking directly at her. "I told you to be gone by today, and you're still here." Mary's voice came out as barely a whisper. "William, please. It's starting to storm outside." The children. "Should have thought about that earlier," William interrupted. "I've been more than patient with you. These gentlemen are here to make sure there's no trouble." The sheriff stepped forward, his hat in his hands. I'm sorry about this, but Mr. William here has legal papers showing this property belongs to him. I have to ask you to gather your things and leave." Mary felt like the world was spinning around her. "But, Sheriff, where can we go? There's a blizzard coming, and I have 3 small children." The sheriff looked genuinely sorry, but he shook his head. "That's not for me to decide, ma'am. The law is the law." Mr. Peterson finally spoke up. "Mary, if you can find somewhere to stay tonight, maybe we can work something out tomorrow." "About the debt, I mean? Maybe there's something?" But William cut him off. "She's had plenty of time to figure this out. I'm done being the generous brother. I've got my own life to live." Mary realized that arguing was useless. These men had made up their minds, and nothing she said was going to change anything. She looked at her children, still huddled together on the bed, watching the adults with frightened eyes. With her heart breaking, Mary began to gather their few belongings. She had one old carpet bag that had belonged to her mother, and she stuffed it with what little clothing they had. The children's winter coats were thin and patched, but they were better than nothing. She wrapped the last of their food in a dishcloth and put it in the bag too. "Can I at least take some blankets?" she asked quietly. William hesitated, then nodded. "Take what you need for the children." Mary took the 3 warmest blankets from the bed and wrapped them around her little ones. Annie and Lucy were crying, now not understanding what was happening, but sensing that something was very wrong. Baby Tom had woken up and was making fussy noises as she picked up Tom and took Annie and Lucy by the hands. Mary looked one last time around the cabin that had been her home. The fire was completely out now, and the room was growing cold quickly. Soon, snow would drift in through the cracks, and mice would probably make nests in the corners. But for 2 years, this had been where she and Robert had built their life. Together, the sheriff opened the door, and the wind immediately whipped snow into the cabin. Outside, the storm was getting worse by the moment Mary stepped away from the cabin with her 3 children, she knew they were in serious trouble. The wind hit them like a wall, so strong that little Lucy almost fell backward. Snow was coming down so thick that Mary could barely see her own feet, let alone figure out which direction to go. Baby Tom started crying immediately. The cold air shocked his little lungs, and he buried his face against Mary's shoulder, trying to hide from the stinging snow. Annie and Lucy pressed close to their mother's sides, their thin coats already getting soaked through. Mary had lived in Wyoming long enough to know what a real blizzard looked like, and this was shaping up to be one of the worst she'd ever seen. The wind was howling like a wild animal, and the temperature was dropping fast. She could feel the cold seeping through her own coat, and her children's coats were even thinner than hers. She tried to remember the layout of the town, thinking of where they might find shelter. The church was about 6 blocks away, but in this storm, 6 blocks might as well be 6 miles. The general store would be locked up tight, and Mr. Peterson had already made it clear he couldn't help them anymore. There was the hotel, but Mary had no money to pay for a room, and she doubted the owner would let them stay out of charity. The snow was getting deeper with every step. At first it was just covering their shoes, but within minutes it was up to the children's ankles. Little Lucy was having trouble walking, and she kept stumbling. Annie was trying to be brave, but Mary could see that she was scared and cold. "Mama, where are we going?" Lucy asked, her small voice almost lost in the wind. Mary didn't know how to answer. She couldn't tell her daughter that they had nowhere to go, that they were walking into a storm with no destination and no plan. So she just said, "We're going to find somewhere warm, sweetheart. Just stay close to Mama." They had only been walking for about 10 minutes when Mary realized they were already lost. The snow was so thick that she couldn't see any landmarks. A few streetlights in town had disappeared behind the white curtain of the storm. She thought they were heading toward the main street, but she couldn't be sure. Baby Tom was getting heavier in her arms. At 3 years old, he was still small, but carrying him while trying to guide the other 2 children through the snow was exhausting. Her arms were starting to ache, and she was getting out of breath. But she couldn't put him down. The snow was too deep, and he was too little to walk through it. The wind kept changing direction, swirling the snow around them in confusing patterns. One minute it seemed like they were walking into the wind. The next minute it was pushing them from behind. Mary's sense of direction was completely gone. She might be walking in circles for all she knew. Annie started crying. "Mama, I'm so cold. My feet hurt." Mary looked down and saw that snow had gotten into Annie's shoes. Her little feet must be like ice. Lucy was shivering so hard that her teeth were chattering, and Mary could see that her lips were starting to turn blue. Mary stopped walking and tried to think. They needed to find shelter soon, or the children were going to get seriously hurt from the cold. But where? She looked around desperately, hoping to see a light or a building. Anything that might offer protection from the storm. All she could see was white. Snow everywhere, falling so fast and thick that it was like being inside a cloud. The wind was so loud that she couldn't hear anything else. No sounds from town, no voices, nothing that might guide them to safety. She tried to adjust. The blankets around the children, pulling them tighter, but the wind kept tearing at the fabric. The blankets were getting wet and heavy with snow, and wet blankets weren't going to keep anyone warm. They started walking again, but it was getting harder with every step. The snow was now up to the middle of Lucy's legs, and she was struggling to lift her feet high enough to take each step. Annie was doing a little better, but Mary could see that both girls were getting tired fast. Mary's own feet were starting to go numb. She had decent boots, but they weren't made for walking through deep snow in a blizzard. Cold was seeping in through every seam, and she could feel her toes getting painful and then gradually losing feeling. Baby Tom had stopped crying, which worried Mary even more than when he had been fussing. He was just lying against her shoulder. quiet and still. She could feel his little body shivering, but he seemed to be getting weaker instead of fighting the cold. "Mama, I can't walk anymore," Lucy said, and Mary looked down to see that her youngest daughter had fallen behind. Lucy was trying to keep up, but her little legs just couldn't push through the snow anymore. Mary's heart sank. She was already carrying Tom, and now Lucy couldn't walk. She tried to think of a solution. Maybe she could carry both of them. But that would leave Annie to walk alone, and Annie was struggling enough as it was. She made a decision that broke her heart. She put Tom down for a moment and picked up Lucy, settling her on her hip. Then she picked up Tom again, now carrying both children. It was almost impossible, but she had no choice. "Annie, you need to hold on to my coat," Mary said. "Go, no matter what." Annie grabbed a handful of Mary's coat with her small, cold hand, and they started walking again. But Mary knew she couldn't carry two children very far. Her arms were already shaking from the weight and the cold, and every step was a struggle. The snow kept getting deeper. It was past Mary's knees now, and walking was like trying to move through thick mud. Each step took enormous effort, and she was breathing hard. The cold air hurt her lungs, and she could feel her strength fading fast. Worse, she was starting to get confused. The cold was affecting her thinking, making it hard to concentrate. She kept forgetting which direction they had been walking, and sometimes she'd find herself standing still without remembering why she had stopped. Annie was crying steadily now, but her cries were getting weaker. Mary looked down and saw that snow had accumulated on the little girl's hair and shoulders. Annie's face was red from the cold, but her lips were turning a scary blue color. Mary tried to remember what Robert had told her about surviving in cold. Whether he'd worked outside in the winter and he'd learned some tricks from the other miners. The most important thing he'd said was to stay dry and find shelter from the wind. But they were already soaked through, and there was no shelter anywhere in sight. She was starting to panic. They'd been walking for what felt like hours, though it was probably only about 30 minutes. But they were no closer to safety than when they started. If anything, they were more lost than before. The wind was getting stronger, and it was blowing the snow around so violently that sometimes Mary couldn't see Annie, even though the little girl was right beside her holding onto her coat. The storm was getting worse instead of better. Mary's legs were shaking from exhaustion and cold. Carrying two children through deep snow was taking everything she had, and she knew she couldn't keep it up much longer. But what choice did she have? She couldn't put the children down. They'd disappear into the snow. Then Lucy went limp in her arms. The little girl had stopped shivering and stopped crying. Her eyes were closed and her breathing was shallow. Mary felt a jolt of terror. She knew enough about cold to know that this was very dangerous. When people stopped shivering, it meant their bodies were giving up the fight against the cold. "Lucy, Lucy, wake up." Mary shook her daughter gently, but Lucy didn't respond. Annie was leaning heavily against Mary's leg now, barely able to stay on her feet. Baby Tom was also too quiet, too still. All three children were showing signs of serious trouble from the cold. Mary looked around desperately, praying to see any sign of shelter. A house, a barn, even a large tree that might block some of the wind. But there was nothing, just snow and wind and darkness. She made another desperate decision. She couldn't keep walking. The children needed warmth right now, not later. She had to find some way to protect them from the wind, even if it wasn't perfect shelter. Through the swirling snow, she thought she could see the dark outline of something large. Maybe a building, or could it be rocks? She couldn't tell for sure, but it was the only thing that looked different from the endless white around them. Using the last of her strength, Mary pushed through the snow toward the dark shape. As she got closer, she realized it was a group of large rocks, probably left behind by some long-ago glacier. It wasn't much, but the rocks created a small area that was slightly protected from the worst of the wind. Mary collapsed behind the rocks, still holding Lucy and Tom. Annie fell down beside her, exhausted. The snow was deep, even in this sheltered spot, but at least the wind wasn't hitting them directly. Mary pulled all the blankets around the children, trying to create a warm space for them. She held them as close as she could, using her own body heat to try to warm them up. But she was cold too, and getting colder by the minute. She looked at her 3 children and felt her heart breaking. Lucy was still unconscious, her breathing slow and shallow. Tom was making weak little sounds, but wasn't really awake. Annie was conscious but barely responsive. Mary knew they were all in serious danger. Without real shelter and warmth, they weren't going to survive much longer. Storm showed no signs of letting up, and they were all getting weaker. She held her children close. Sayan tried to think of what to do next. But her own thinking was getting fuzzy from the cold. She found herself forgetting what she was trying to remember. Wind was howling like nothing Jake had ever heard before, and he'd lived through plenty of Wyoming winters. He pulled his hat down low and wrapped his heavy coat tighter around himself as he guided his horse Thunder through the blizzard. The big brown stallion was struggling too, fighting against the wind and snow with every step. Jake had been checking on his cattle when the storm hit. He owned a decent-sized ranch about 5 miles outside of town, and he'd learned the hard way that storms like this could kill livestock if you weren't prepared. He'd managed to get most of his herd into the sheltered valley behind his property, but it had taken longer than expected. Now he was caught out in the worst part of the storm. Thunder was a good horse, steady and smart, and Jake trusted him completely. They'd been through tough situations before, and the horse had never let him down. But even Thunder was having trouble tonight. The snow was deep and getting deeper, and the wind kept trying to push them off course. Jake squinted through the swirling snow, trying to see the lights of his ranch house. He should be getting close by now, but everything looked the same in this white mess. Trees, rocks, and buildings all disappeared behind the thick curtain of falling snow. Suddenly, Thunder stopped walking. The horse planted his feet and refused to go forward, snorting and shaking his head. Jake knew this behavior. Thunder only acted like this when something was seriously wrong. "What is it, boy?" Jake said, patting the horse's neck. "What do you see?" Thunder stepped sideways and lowered his head, sniffing at something in the snow. Jake squinted down and saw what looked like a dark patch against the white ground. At first, he thought it might be a fallen branch or maybe some debris blown by the wind. But as he looked closer, something didn't seem right. The shape was too regular, too organized to be natural. Jake dismounted from Thunder and brushed away some of the snow with his gloved hand. His heart nearly stopped when he realized what he was looking at. It was fabric. Blankets, actually. And underneath the blankets, he could see the outline of what looked like people. "Dear God," Jake whispered, and started digging faster as he cleared away more snow. He found a woman and 3 small children, all of them unconscious and blue with cold. The woman was curled around the children, trying to protect them with her body in the blankets. But snow had covered them completely. Jake had seen men freeze to death before, and he knew the signs. These people were in serious trouble. Their lips were blue, their skin was pale and cold to the touch, and they weren't responding when he spoke to them. But they were still breathing, which meant there was still hope. Without wasting another second, Jake picked up the smallest child, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. The child was limp and cold, but Jake could feel a faint heartbeat. He wrapped the boy in his own coat and then went back for the others. The woman was harder to move because she was bigger, but Jake managed to lift her and carry her to Thunder. One of the little girls was stirring slightly, making weak sounds, but the other one seemed to be in the worst shape. It's completely unresponsive. Getting all 4 people onto Thunder was a challenge, but Jake had loaded injured cattle before, and he used the same techniques now. Put the woman in front of him and held the 3 children against his chest, wrapping his coat around all of them as much as possible. "Come on, Thunder," Jake said. "Get us home fast." The horse seemed to understand the urgency. Despite the storm and the heavy load, Thunder moved as quickly as he safely could through the deep snow. Jake held the unconscious family tight against him, trying to share what body heat he could, while praying they weren't too late. The ride to his ranch house felt like it took forever, but it was probably only about 10 minutes. Jake's house was a sturdy log cabin that he'd built himself, with a good fireplace and thick walls that kept out the wind. As soon as he saw the welcome glow of his windows through the snow, Jake felt a surge of relief. He carried the woman and children inside, and laid them down on the floor near his fireplace. The fire had burned down while he was out, but there were still good coals. Jake quickly threw some kindling and logs on the fire, building it up until flames were dancing high and throwing heat into the room. Then he went to work trying to save their lives. Jake had learned some things about treating frozen people from other ranchers and from his own experiences with harsh winters. The most important thing was to warm them up gradually. Warming them too fast could actually make things worse. He heated some stones in the fire and wrapped them in towels, and placed them carefully around the bodies of the woman and children. He rubbed their hands and feet gently, trying to get their blood moving again. He heated up some broth on his stove and tried to get a few drops into their mouths. The woman was the first to show signs of improvement. After about an hour of warming, she started to move slightly and make soft sounds. Her eyelids fluttered, and Jake could see that she was trying to wake up. "Easy there," Jake said softly. "You're safe now. You're in my house, and you're going to be okay." The woman's eyes opened, unfocused and confused. She looked around the room, clearly not knowing where she was or what had happened. "My children," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are my children?" "They're right here," Jake said, pointing to the 3 little ones lying near the fire. "They're warming up just like you are. They're going to be fine." The woman tried to sit up, but she was too weak. Jake helped her lean against some pillows he'd brought from his bedroom. She looked at her children with tears in her eyes. "I thought we were going to die," she said. "I thought I'd failed them." "You didn't fail anybody," Jake said firmly. "You kept them alive long enough for help to come. That takes courage." One of the little girls, the one who had been stirring earlier, opened her eyes and looked around. She saw her mother and immediately started crying, reaching out with weak little arms. "Mama," the girl said, "I was so scared." The woman, Jake still didn't know her name, gathered her daughter close, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, Annie. Mama's here, and we're safe now." Jake smiled as he watched the reunion. The little girl was responding well to the warming treatment. Her color was coming back. She seemed alert and aware of her surroundings. But the other 2 children were still unconscious. The other little girl was breathing steadily, and Jake thought she was probably going to be okay with more time. But the little boy worried him. The child's breathing was shallow. He wasn't responding to any of Jake's attempts to wake him up. Jake had done everything he knew how to do. He'd warmed them gradually, given them heated stones for warmth, and tried to get some warm broth into them. Now it was just a matter of waiting and hoping their bodies could recover from the severe cold. "What's your name?" Jake asked the woman, as he continued to work on warming the children. "Mary," she said. "Mary Coleman. These are my children. Annie, Lucy, and Tom." She pointed to each child as she said their names. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said. "This is my ranch. You're about 5 miles outside of town." Mary's eyes widened. 5 miles. How did we get so far from town? "Blizzards can be confusing," Jake said. "It's easy to get turned around when you can't see." "Where you're going? What were you doing out in this storm?" Mary's face darkened, and Jake could see pain in her eyes that had nothing to do with the cold. "We had nowhere else to go," she said quietly. Jake didn't push for more details. He could see that whatever had happened, it was painful for Mary to talk about. There would be time for explanations later, after everyone was safe and warm, Lucy. The other little girl started to wake up. Like her sister, she immediately looked for her mother and started crying when she saw Mary. "Mama, where are we?" Lucy asked. "We're with a kind man named Jake," Mary said, smoothing Lucy's hair. "He saved us from the storm." Jake brought some warm milk over to the girls. "Think you can drink a little of this?" he asked. Both Annie and Lucy nodded and took small sips. The warm milk seemed to help them feel better, and soon they were sitting up and looking around Jake's cabin with curious eyes, but Tom still wasn't waking up. Jake was getting more worried about the little boy. He was the smallest of the 3 children, and small bodies lost heat faster than bigger ones. Jake had been working on him for over 2 hours now, and while Tom's breathing seemed a little stronger, he still wasn't conscious. "Is Tom going to be okay?" Mary asked, and Jake could hear the fear in her voice. "I think so," Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "He's the smallest, so it's taking him longer to warm up. But his breathing is getting better, and his colors improving. Jake continued to rub Tom's hands and feet, and he moved the little boy closer to the fire. He heated up another stone and placed it carefully near Tom's body, making sure it wasn't too hot. Finally, after what felt like forever, Tom's eyes fluttered open. The little boy looked around in confusion, then saw his mother and sisters. "Mama," Tom said in a small voice, "I'm hungry." Mary laughed and cried at the same time. "Oh, Tom, my sweet boy." Jake felt a huge wave of relief. All 4 members of the family were awake and talking, which meant they were going to survive. It had been too close, but they'd made it tea. The morning after the storm brought bright sunshine and a world covered in sparkling white snow. Mary woke up in Jake's spare bedroom, confused for a moment about where she was. Then everything came rushing back, the blizzard being thrown out of her cabin, nearly freezing to death with her children. She sat up quickly and looked around. Annie and Lucy were still sleeping peacefully in the bed next to her, their faces pink and healthy looking. But where was Tom? Mary's heart started racing until she heard familiar laughter coming from the kitchen. She wrapped a blanket around herself and hurried toward the sound. What she saw made her stop in the doorway. Jake was sitting at his kitchen table with little Tom on his lap, helping the boy eat a bowl of oatmeal. Tom was giggling as Jake made funny faces and airplane noises with the spoon. For the first time in months, her youngest child looked completely happy and carefree. "Good morning," Jake said when he saw Mary. "Hope you don't mind." Tom woke up early and was hungry. "We didn't want to wake you ladies up." Mary felt tears in her eyes. After everything they'd been through, seeing her son safe and laughing felt like a miracle. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Jake looked embarrassed by her gratitude. "Just doing what anyone would do," he said. "Coffee's on the stove if you want some." As Mary poured herself a cup of coffee, she really looked around Jake's cabin for the first time. Last night, she'd been too scared and cold to notice much, but now she could see that Jake had built himself a comfortable home. The cabin was bigger than it had seemed last night. There was a good-sized kitchen with a proper stove and plenty of cupboards. The main room had a large fireplace with comfortable chairs arranged around it. Everything was clean and well organized, but it felt lived in and welcoming. What struck Mary most was how quiet it was. After months of worrying about money and dealing with people who wanted things from her, the peaceful silence of Jake's home felt like a blessing. "How long have you lived here?" Mary asked as she sat down at the table. "Built this place about 8 years ago," Jake said. "You've been ranching this land ever since? All by yourself?" Jake nodded. "Just me and Thunder and the cattle. It's a good life." Mary could hear something in his voice when he said that, something that sounded almost like loneliness. But before she could think about it more, Annie and Lucy came stumbling into the kitchen, still sleepy but drawn by the smell of food. "Mama." Lucy ran to Mary and climbed onto her lap. "Is the storm over?" "Yes, sweetheart," Mary said, holding her daughter close. "The storm is over." Jake made breakfast for all of them, eggs from his chickens, bacon from his own pigs, and fresh biscuits that he seemed to make without any effort at all. Mary couldn't remember the last time her children had eaten such a good meal. After breakfast, Jake showed them around his property. Snow was still deep, but the sun was shining, and the children were fascinated by everything they saw. Had chickens and pigs, a big barn for his horses, and pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. "How many cows do you have?" Annie asked, staring out at the herd in the distance. "About 200 head, Jake said. Takes a lot of work to take care of them all, but they take care of me too." Tom was particularly interested in the horses. Jake let him pet Thunder's nose, and the big stallion was gentle as a lamb with the little boy. Mary had never seen Tom so interested in anything before. "Can I ride him?" Tom asked, looking up at Jake with hopeful eyes. "Maybe when you're a little bigger," Jake said with a smile. "But I could teach you to ride one of the smaller horses if your mama says it's okay." Tom looked at Mary with pleading eyes, and she found herself nodding. Why not? After everything they'd been through, her children deserved some happiness. Over the next few days, Mary and her children settled into life at Jake's ranch. Mary insisted on helping with the household chores, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes. Jake protested at first, saying they were his guests and should rest. But Mary couldn't stand the idea of being useless. She discovered that Jake was a better cook than she'd expected for a man living alone. But he was hopeless with things like mending and keeping house organized. His clothes had holes that needed patching, and his cupboards were a mess. "How do you find anything in here?" Mary asked, looking at Jake's disorganized kitchen shelves. Jake looked sheepish. "I guess I just grab whatever I can find and hope for the best." Mary spent an afternoon reorganizing his kitchen, putting things together and making sure everything had a proper place. When Jake came in from working with the cattle that evening, he stopped and stared. "This looks like a real kitchen now," he said, amazement in his voice. "A place for everything and everything in its place," Mary said. "That's what my mother used to say." As the days passed, Mary found herself relaxing for the first time in months. There was something about Jake's, the steady presence that made her feel safe. He was patient with the children, respectful toward her, never made her feel like she was a burden. Jake, for his part, seemed to enjoy having the family around. Mary noticed that he smiled more when the children were nearby, and he went out of his way to make little toys for them, wooden horses for Tom, a dollhouse for the girls. One evening, as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed, Jake asked Mary about what had happened to bring them out into the storm. Mary found herself telling him everything about Robert's death, about the mounting debts, about William throwing them out of their home. Jake listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as she explained how her brother-in-law had treated them. "That's not right," Jake said when she finished. "Family should take care of family, not throw them out into a blizzard." "William said he couldn't afford to support us," Mary said. Maybe he was right. 3 extra mouths to feed is a lot to ask of anyone. Jake looked at her with something that might have been anger. "That's not about money. It's about being a decent human being. Is any man who'd throw a woman and children out into a storm like that? ... double quotes. He shook his head. "That's not a man at all." Mary felt a warmth spread through her chest at Jake's fierce defense of her and her children. It had been so long since anyone had been on her side, had been angry on her behalf. "What will you do now?" Jake asked gently. Mary had been trying not to think about that question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been thinking maybe I could find work in one of the bigger towns. Denver, maybe. Someone might need a cook or a housekeeper." "What about the children? I'd have to take them with me." "I can't afford to send them to school, and I won't give them up." Mary's voice was firm on that point. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "You know," he said finally, "I could use some help around here. The ranch keeps me busy, and I'm not much good at the household things. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of work." Mary looked at him suspiciously. "Jake, you don't need to offer me charity. We'll manage somehow." "It's not charity," Jake said quickly. "It's a job offer. I'd pay you fair wages, and you and the children could stay in the spare room. Children could help with small chores as they get older. Tom's already showing interest in the horses." Mary felt her heart beating faster. Could it really be that? Simple. A job, a place to live, safety for her children. "I don't know," she said. "Wouldn't be proper, me living here with you when we're not ... married." Jake finished for her. "I know. People would talk." They sat in comfortable silence. For a while, both thinking about the complications of the situation, Mary found herself studying Jake's profile in the firelight. He was a good man. She could see that. Kind, hard-working, patient with her children. He'd risked his own life to save them from the storm, but marriage was a big step. Mary had loved Robert deeply, and part of her felt like accepting another man's proposal would be betraying his memory. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now," Jake said, as if he could read her thoughts. "Just think about it. You and the children are welcome here as long as you want to stay." The next morning, Mary woke up to the sound of Tom laughing. Outside, she looked out the window and saw Jake teaching her son how to milk the cow. Tom was concentrating so hard on the task that his little tongue was sticking out, and Jake was patiently guiding his small hands. Annie and Lucy were gathering eggs from the chicken coop, chattering happily as they filled their basket. All 3 of her children looked healthier and happier than they had in months. Mary realized that she felt different too. The constant worry that had been eating at her stomach for so long was gone. She wasn't wondering where their next meal would come from or whether they'd have a roof over their heads that night. For the first time since Robert's death, Mary allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve constant struggle and fear. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe this could work. As she watched her children playing in the snow outside Jake's cabin, Mary felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt hope. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to feel something else too. Something that might, in time, grow into love. That evening, as they gathered around Jake's table for dinner, Mary looked around at her children's smiling faces and at Jake's kind eyes. And she thought that maybe, after all the darkness they'd been through, they'd finally found their way to the light. She wasn't ready to make any big decisions yet. But for the first time in a long time, Mary believed that everything might actually turn out all right. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing new life to the prairie. Mary had been living at Jake's ranch for 3 months now, and it felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since Robert died. The children were thriving. Tom could now milk the cow by himself. Annie helped gather eggs every morning, and Lucy had learned to feed the chickens without being afraid of them. Mary and Jake had settled into a comfortable routine. She took care of the house and cooking while Jake worked with the cattle and horses. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire while the children played, talking about the day's work or planning improvements to the ranch. But Mary knew this peaceful time couldn't last forever. People in town were starting to talk about the widow and her children living alone with the bachelor rancher. So far, no one had said anything directly to Mary, but she could see the looks when she went to town for supplies. More importantly, Mary could feel her own heart changing. She'd started the arrangement thinking of Jake as a kind employer who was helping her family. But somewhere along the way, her feelings had become much more complicated. She found herself watching Jake when he didn't know she was looking, noticing the gentle way he handled the horses, the patience he showed with her children, the quiet strength he brought to everything he did. When he smiled at something one of the children said, Mary felt her own heart warm. When he worked outside in the hot sun, she found herself making excuses to bring him water, just so she could spend a few extra minutes talking with him. Jake seemed to be having his own struggles. More than once, Mary had caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He'd started bringing her small gifts, wildflowers he'd found while checking on the cattle, a pretty stone Tom might like, a book he'd ordered from town because he thought she'd enjoy reading it. The tension between them was growing, but neither seemed ready to talk about it directly. Then, one bright April morning, everything changed. Mary was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see 3 men riding toward the ranch house. Her heart sank when she recognized the man in front. It was William, her late husband's brother. William hadn't changed much in the months since he'd thrown her out. He still had that mean look in his eyes, and he still carried himself like a man who thought the world owed him something. The 2 men with him looked like hired hands, rough-looking men with guns on their hips. Jake came out of the barn when he heard the horses. Mary could see him tense up as the riders approached. He walked over to stand between the men and the house where Mary and the children were. "You must be Morrison," William said, not bothering to get down from his horse. "I'm William Coleman. I've come for my brother's widow and her children." "I don't think Mary wants to go anywhere with you," Jake said calmly, but Mary could hear the steel in his voice. William laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "What Mary wants doesn't matter much. I'm family, and those children belong with family. Besides, I've been hearing some interesting stories about what's been going on out here." Mary felt her face burn with anger and shame. She knew what William was implying, and it made her sick to her stomach. "There's nothing improper happening here," Mary said, stepping forward. "Mr. Morrison has been nothing but respectful." "Sure he has," William said with a sneer.
Ah!
"A widow woman living alone with a man, no husband, no chaperone. What do you think people are saying about that?" "I don't much care what people are saying," Jake said, his voice getting harder. "And I don't think you really care about Mary's reputation, so why don't you tell us what you really want?" William's fake concern dropped away. and his real nature showed through. Fine. I want the children. He's got legal rights as their uncle, and I'm taking them back to live with proper family. Mary felt like the world was tilting around her. You can't take my children. You're the one who threw us out in the first place. That was different, William said. I couldn't afford to take care of all of you then, but I can take the children now. They'll work on my farm, earn their keep. Be better for them than living in sin out here, the casual way he talked about. Making her children work like farm hands made Mary's blood boil. These were her babies, not free labor for William's farm. Over my dead body, Mary said, her voice shaking with rage. That can be arranged, one of William's hired men said, his hand moving toward his gun. But Jake stepped forward, and Mary was shocked to see that he suddenly looked very dangerous. His easygoing manner was completely gone, replaced by something that made even William's tough-looking companions take notice. I wouldn't finish that movement if I were you, Jake said quietly. I've got friends in town who know exactly who rode out here today. If anything happens to Mary or these children, people will know where to look. The hired man's hand stopped moving toward his gun, but William wasn't backing down. Can't fight the law, Morrison. I've got legal papers that say I'm the children's guardian. Sheriff will back me up. What papers? Jake asked. Show me these legal documents you're talking about. William reached into his coat and pulled out some official-looking papers. Jake took them and read through them carefully. Mary watched his face, trying to read his expression. These papers don't say what you think they say, Jake said finally. They say you have the right to petition for guardianship if Mary is proven unfit, or if she abandons the children. She's done neither. William's face was getting red with anger. She's living in sin with you. That makes her unfit. Actually, it doesn't, Jake said. Mary works for me as my housekeeper. She lives in the spare room with her children. There's nothing sinful about that arrangement. Nobody's going to believe that story. Sheriff Johnson will, Jake said. He's been out here several times to buy cattle. He's seen how things are arranged. Pastor Williams from the church has been here too. Both of them will testify that everything here is proper and respectable. Mary felt a surge of gratitude toward Jake. She hadn't realized that he'd been protecting her reputation all along by making sure respectable people from town knew about their living arrangements. William was looking frustrated now. His legal threat wasn't working, and Jake clearly wasn't going to be intimidated. Fine, William said, but this isn't over. People are talking, Morrison. Mary's reputation is already damaged. You think any decent man is going to want her now? That comment hit Mary like a physical blow. She knew William was probably right. What decent man would want a woman who'd been living alone with another man, even if nothing improper had happened? But Jake surprised her by laughing. Actually, I know of one man who'd be honored to have her. Mary stared at him, not understanding what he meant. I'm asking Mary to marry me, Jake announced, looking directly at William. We've been talking about it for weeks, just haven't made it official yet. Mary's heart stopped. They hadn't been talking about marriage at all. Jake was making this up to protect her from William's threats. But the way he said it, the way he looked at her when he said it, made her wonder if maybe it wasn't entirely made up. William's mouth fell open. He clearly hadn't expected this. Mary, Jake said, turning to look at her, will you marry me? Looked at Jake's face and saw something there that took her breath away. This wasn't just a show for William. Jake meant it. He was really proposing to her right here, right now. In front of everyone, Mary thought about everything Jake had done for her and her children. He'd saved their lives, given them a home, treated them with kindness and respect. He'd been patient with her grief, gentle with her children, and protective of her reputation. More than that, she realized she'd fallen in love with him. Somewhere between that first night when he'd saved them from the storm and this moment, her gratitude had grown into something much deeper. Yes, Mary said, her voice strong and clear. Yes, I'll marry you. Jake's face lit up with a smile that was brighter than the spring sunshine. He walked over to Mary and took her hands in his. Well, I guess that settles things, Jake said to William, not taking his eyes off Mary. Mary's going to be my wife, and I'm going to adopt the children. They'll have a proper father and a good home. William looked like he wanted to argue more, but there wasn't much he could say. His hired men were getting restless, and it was clear that Jake wasn't going to back down. This isn't over, William said again, but his threat sounded hollow now. Yes, it is, Jake said firmly. And if you come around here bothering my family again, you'll have me to deal with." William and his men rode away, but Mary barely noticed. She was still staring at Jake, still holding his hands, still trying to believe that this was really happening. "Did you mean it?" she asked quietly. "Every word," Jake said. "I've been wanting to ask you for weeks, but I wasn't sure how you felt about me." "I love you," Mary said. And saying the words out loud felt like the most natural thing in the world. Jake kissed her then, right there in front of the children and God and everyone. Annie and Lucy started giggling, and Tom ran over to hug both of them. "Does this mean Jake's going to be our papa?" Tom asked. "If that's okay with you," Jake said, kneeling down to be at eye level.